if you grew up in the early to mid-2000s, you lived through the worst of Disney's infamous straight-to-DVD sequel era. But one aspect of that time period that isn't talked about as much is how a few of those sequels weren't just shameless cash grabs, but also pilots for potential cartoon series on either Disney Channel or Toon Disney. Sometimes it'd be a film-length story to introduce the premise of the show, other times it was just the first 2 or 3 episodes hastily cobbled together. And despite the DVD sequel era being dead for over 15 years, Disney somehow fell back into old habits with Moana 2. See, what you might not know is that this was originally announced way back in 2020 as a big-budget Disney Plus series similar to what we've gotten from the MCU and Star Wars. And it was only this past February when the company officially announced it had shifted plans and would be turning the show into a theatrical sequel. And once you walk in knowing all that, you can't help but notice the seams of what was initially made for the show and what changes were likely made late in the game. The first big giveaway is the story. Having rediscovered her people's roots as seafaring explorers in the first film, Moana still hasn't had any luck in making contact with any other tribes in 3 years. It turns out there's a good reason for this. A magic island that used to connect all the various tribes has deliberately been sunk to the bottom of the sea by a power-hungry ocean god. And with Maui having been kidnapped and Moana being given only the general direction of where to find the island, she has to form her own crew and set off on her biggest voyage yet. And it's with that journey you can see how this would have been an episodic story, which parts stuck around and what got chopped off. The song where Moana decides to start the journey ends with a shot that I will bet money on was intended to be where the credits would have rolled for the first episode. Moana's 3 crewmates all have distinct designs, but fairly one-note character traits that likely would have been fleshed out if given the time. Maui's absence from the first half was likely a carryover of a cost-saving measure to not have to pay The Rock for every episode. The second act centers around a fight with a giant clam, which likely would have been its own episode. A mini-boss who works for the story's big bad has a sudden face turn when they decide to help Moana, all but promising they'll play a bigger role in future events, and said big bad isn't actually shown until a mid-credits scene, setting the stage for what would have been a season 2 that'll now be Moana 3. Now, the fact that you can recognize the patterns of how this was stitched together into a movie doesn't necessarily make it bad, but it does make it more forgettable. Aside from the final battle, none of the action scenes are memorable. The same exposition keeps getting delivered over and over, and characters like Moana and Maui have to find, lose, and regain their motivation multiple times. And none of this is helped by the new batch of songs paling in comparison to the first movie. However you feel about Lin-Manuel's work post-Hamilton, you can't deny the man had a knack for writing catchy, memorable tunes, and his absence this time around is felt throughout. As for the positive notes, Maui is still a fun character and a great embodiment of Dwayne Johnson's charisma. Moana is still a strong protagonist, even if her story is starting to crib a few too many notes from Avatar: The Last Airbender, and if there's one thing this project didn't cut corners on from the start, it's the animation, especially when it comes to anything involving water. And for all its faults, this is still better than Walt Disney Animation's last 2 theatrical offerings. But just like how Frozen 2 tried to expand its world and wound up getting stretched too thin, Moana 2 tries to go bigger, but can't come close to what the original pulled off. It'll still probably rake in big numbers at the box office, but don't expect this to knock off other films like Wild Robot in the conversation for best animated movies of the year. Take the kids if you got them, otherwise you can skip it. Thanks for watching.